Hello, bookworms. I'm Hallie.
And I'm Brittany.
And thank you for diving back into the Abyss Book Club this month while we discuss Adnan's Story by Rabia Chaudry. We're super excited about it. Brittany especially. She knows so much about this case, so get prepared for some inquisitive rants. Make sure that you're following us on all of social media. That way we can reach out to you about new episodes, and we can make sure that you're staying up to date on new cases if we post updates, or even just to see some funny memes that we post here and there. We got to lighten the tension just a little bit. We also have a Patreon now, so if you want to support our show, go ahead to our website. You can click on our Patreon link and donate a couple bucks a month just to support the Abyss Pod. If you didn't read the book this month, that's okay, but this case is really intensive, so we're going to try and cover it as best as we can, kind of like we do with the other nonfiction books like Iceman. Buckle up your seatbelt and get ready. To start it off, we're going to jump into the summary of the book, kind of to give you a refresher about what the book was all about. Quote, Serial only told part of the story. In early 2000, Adnan Syed was convicted and sentenced to life plus 30 years for the murder of his ex-girlfriend Hae Min Lee, a high school senior in Baltimore, Maryland. Syed has maintained his innocence, and Rabia Chaudry, a family friend, has always believed him. By 2013, after almost all appeals had been exhausted, Rabia contacted Sarah Koenig, a producer at This American Life, in hopes of finding a journalist who could shed light on Adnan's story. In 2014, Koenig's investigation turned into Serial, a Peabody Award-winning podcast with more than 500 million international listeners. But Serial did not tell the whole story. In this compelling narrative, Rabia Chaudry presents new key evidence that she maintains dismantles the state's case, a potential new suspect, forensics indicating Hae was killed and kept somewhere for almost half a day, and documentation withheld by the state that destroys the cell phone evidence, among many other points. And she shows how fans of Serial joined a crowdsourced investigation into a case riddled with errors and strange twists. Adnan's story also shares Adnan's life in prison and weaves in his personal reflections, including never-before-seen letters. Chaudry, who is committed to exonerating Adnan, makes it clear that justice is yet to be achieved in this much-examined case. End quote.
Before we get started, we just want to say this is in no way an exhaustive look at the case or covering every single fact in the case. This one is huge, and there's so many pieces to it that fit together, and we're just trying to go through kind of the main points that were brought up in this book. We're going to tell the overview of the story, but this is just a general look at the case and some of the significant pieces of it as laid out in the book by Rabia. There's a ton of information out there on this case, and we highly, highly encourage you to go out and research for yourself. You can also listen to Undisclosed. Most of you have probably heard Serial, and there's lots of other resources out there too.
Honestly, we switched it up this time too. So I did the audiobook and Brittany actually read the book this time. And the audiobook itself was like 14 hours. So for us to cover like every single detail, because the book, if you read it with us, it was like important information after important information after important information, and numbers and dates and times and notes and all kinds of stuff. So for us to include every single thing, this episode would be so long it's not even funny, so we had to sum it up a little bit for you guys.
But that being said, we're going to start off at the beginning and talk a little bit about the background of this case. Adnan Syed went to high school with Hae Min Lee at Woodlawn High. This school had kind of a bad history, and Baltimore County itself, where Woodlawn High is, kind of has a bad problem with crime and things like that.
Brittany would know. She lived around that area before.
At Woodlawn High, a guy had actually gotten stabbed by his friend, and he was all right in the end, but it's just one of the crazy things that happened there.
Yeah, like you're not supposed to have weapons on campus in general, for one, and then for them to get as far as stabbing someone, like that's just wow.
Adnan and Hae had been kind of casual friends throughout school. They started dating after Adnan asked her to prom, and he made this really sweet gesture there. He became prom king, and she didn't get prom queen, but after dancing with the prom queen a little bit, he went over and asked Hae to dance, and she thought that was really sweet. She wrote about it in her diary, and so after that, they kind of became an official item. Both Hae and Adnan had very strict parents, and they had to really sneak around in their relationship. Because of this, they were kind of on and off, and it put a pretty big strain on their relationship, just having to sneak around and manage each of them having strict parents. Hae was very, very passionate, and she was kind of the typical teenage girl where every romance is kind of the be-all, end-all, and she wrote about it all in her diary, about how smitten she was with Adnan and how sweet he was. The constant breakups were hard for the two, and eventually they just saw that the relationship just wasn't going to work. So they broke it off for good, but they remained really good friends. By all accounts, even though breakups are always hard, Adnan wasn't really angry about it. He was looking forward to moving on with other girls, to college, to his career, and all of the stuff that was ahead of him. They remained really good friends, and they even joked about who they were dating at the time and things like that. So there really wasn't any animosity between the two. Shortly after their final breakup, Hae started dating Don, who was an older guy from the lens crafters that she worked at. On January 13th, 1999, Hae was supposed to pick up her cousin from school, as she often did, but she didn't show. After no one could get a hold of her, she was eventually reported missing. She was last seen around 3 p.m. when school ended that day. Within a couple of hours, the police had marked this as a missing person, despite Hae being an adult and having a car and a new boyfriend and all of that stuff that usually makes police hesitate on actually filing missing persons reports. In the book, Rabia talks about how strange it was that they were so suddenly on this case, and I agree it's a little bit odd considering all the circumstances of the case, but that's what they did. One of the officers, Officer Adcock, called the list of people associated with Hae, including Adnan, who was at the time getting high with a friend named Jay Wilds. Adcock also tried to call Don, but he wasn't able to contact him until 1:30 a.m. that day. Even then, Don's whereabouts were not confirmed, and he had thus far made no attempt to contact Hae or her family or anything. Adcock also had failed to put Hae's car into the system, so surrounding police didn't really have a connection to her car at that point, but police were told to be on the lookout for it. There was a huge storm in the area at that time, and school was out for a couple of days, so Hae's friends didn't really realize that she was missing at that point. One of her friends, Debbie, eventually did make a fake Facebook account to talk to Don and get some info. She thought maybe he was hiding Hae or he knew where she was. They had a really long conversation, and by the end of it, she was convinced that he had nothing to do with it. During this, Don mentioned that Adnan may have been involved. We don't really know if that's in a kind of deflective way or just throwing out possible names like her other friends. There was also a note that was later found that had kind of a cryptic message, and it just said, Hae's new boyfriend assaulted Debbie. And there wasn't a lot more information about that, but it was kind of a strange coincidence there. Around this time, Adnan was acting normal. He didn't really realize anything was super wrong, and he was just going about his life. Rumors did spark that Hae may have been in California. Dawn had mentioned that she had talked about going to California. She had family there, and that's kind of where that rumor first started. But it didn't really make sense. Hae had this new boyfriend. She had a trip paid for to France with her school, and she had made no mention of going to California in her diary, which she wrote pretty much everything in.
Police started talking to friends to see who Hae was in contact with mostly, and then they were led to look into Adnan and Don even more closely.
It didn't really seem like they ever had Don that much locked in their sights, despite him kind of acting shady around this time.
Don did have to go through questioning, and he said at first that he hadn't seen or talked even to Hae in a while. Then he came back and changed it later and provided an alibi for the first time. He said he was at work at 9 a.m., but no one was ever scheduled for 9 a.m. shifts, so this was a little strange. He also used a different ID number twice during the time of Hae's murder, both in the same week. This is really abnormal, and when people have talked to the company and managers, it's pretty much impossible that he would have two different ID numbers. It's a fault in the system, and that never really happens. So for him to have a different ID number for these supposed alibi hours that he was working, and it only be 2 times in the week that Hae was murdered for the entirety of his job, it's a little fishy. Also, it has to be adjusted within 2 weeks, which goes straight up to the day that Don was first questioned by police. So it kind of makes you wonder if that led him to make the change because of the fact that he knew police were kind of suspicious about him. Not to mention that a manager at the facility is his mother. So it also makes you wonder if she could have easily gone in and messed with some of the numbers as well, changed ID numbers, clocked in, clocked out, and adjusted schedules for Don's alibi. So then it provides question to if his alibi is even strong enough. In fact, Don got off the hook a lot during questioning. His story also changed a lot. Obviously, his alibi was a little wonky, so none of this is really a good sign. But the police kind of questioned him and then were like, nah, he's fine, and just dropped it. So that's a little concerning because any true crime addict knows that all of those lead to bad answers if you were to combine them in a murder case. Not to mention that Hae said she was going to meet Don at the mall before she went missing. So nothing was really adding up from what Don was saying, and this makes him very fishy in my eyes. And ultimately, police do not really verify Don's alibi. They just kind of drop it. When looking into Adnan, they found out that he lent his car to Jay the day that Hae went missing. Jay was the person that Adnan bought drugs from, and he was also Adnan's friend's boyfriend. Officer O'Shea asked Adnan if he had asked Hae for a ride that day that she went missing, and the officer says that Adnan said he asked for a ride but was late and Hae must have left without him because he didn't end up seeing her. Adnan denies that he ever said this and that O'Shea was lying. This could possibly be part of a cover-up to add it in later or a miscommunication. Police also asked one of the French teachers at Woodlawn High School about Adnan and Hae's sex life and basically places that they would have sex, and gave her a list of questions to answer.
This seems highly inappropriate and kind of just a way of questioning children without their parents present, especially since this was not mentioned in the police report, and just getting a teacher to ask about the sex lives of students seems really disgusting.
Yeah, like why would the teacher even be responsible for knowing something like that? On February 3rd, detectives looked into Adnan's personal record, but they didn't really look into anybody else's, which seems pretty targeted. 6 days after that, Alonzo Sellers, who was a habitual streaker working at a college, found Hae's body when he stopped to urinate just minutes from work on the way back from picking up something at home. This whole situation is very weird because he had gone home and he was drinking a beer and driving back to work. He took a busier road that was out of the way, and then he pulled over because he had to pee, even though he was only minutes from his work. I guess he just didn't want to hold it. Pulled over to pee, and a streaker, a habitual streaker, decided to go deep in the woods to pee, so that way cars couldn't see him. This all just seems very weird. He was given 2 polygraphs, and they had completely different questions. The first one he failed because they were super targeted questions and he was deceptive on them. But on the second one he passed, and the questions they asked him on the second time was, do you know if Hae was strangled? Do you know if Hae was stabbed? Do you know if Hae knew her attacker? And he passed those, but he didn't pass the first one. And the types of questions that they asked on the second one, I can't remember exactly how they had phrased them, but when reading them in the book, you just could tell that they would be easy questions to get by on.
Rabia thinks that this was police kind of manipulating the situation to make sure that Sellers passed the second polygraph so they could pretend that they did their due diligence but had counted him out, even though using polygraphs for that is stupid. But normally in a polygraph, if you fail the first one, they ask you similar or the same questions on the second one to see if there's like a pattern of deception, and asking him 2 completely different sets of questions is a very strange tactic.
Yeah, kind of just a way of covering their behinds. After this second polygraph test, they never really talked to him again, which is another thing. They just dropped off. Don and now Alonzo, they just didn't pay close attention to anybody other than Adnan, it seemed. The location that he discovered Hae was in Leakin Park, and She had been strangled and left beside of this log deep into the woods, somewhat obscured. When the police came and took her body and started doing tests on it, it was mentioned that animal activity was the cause of her body being exposed, but there was no animal activity in her autopsy report, which is kind of odd since she was out there for a little less than a month. There was also very little decomposition as well, which she was tucked back into the woods, so you would think that bugs, worms, animals, anything like that would have at least done some sort of damage to the body inside of a park in Baltimore, but this was not the case.
A couple days later, a man walked into the police station to report a suspicious man that he had seen at Leakin Park the day that Hae went missing. Police pretty much dismissed him entirely. They never contacted him again.
Sounds familiar.
They really had no interest in his story whatsoever. Obviously, Hae's family was super distraught and they wanted to do whatever they could to find their daughter's killer. They hired a woman named Mandy Johnson as sort of a private investigator, even though she wasn't technically a real private investigator. She didn't really have the credentials, but they hired her to investigate, and she went on to investigate Hae's case on behalf of her family. She based a lot of her findings on Hae's diary and accounts from friends and things like that. Again, she wasn't really a qualified private investigator or law enforcement, so she didn't really have that training behind her. She had Hae's diary for a while and really scoured it for details. From Hae's diary, Mandy Johnson decided that Adnan was very possessive and controlling, and she basically decided that he was a bad guy without ever really talking to him or qualifying her position. She didn't really have like specific details she could point to and say that Hae called him controlling or anything like that. It was more just her feeling. She also kind of fancied herself an authority on Muslims, even though she clearly didn't really know much about them at all. And that suggested that a lot of her opinion was kind of based on racial stereotyping and just a fundamental misunderstanding of Islam. She talked to Don a little bit, but doesn't really ask him any questions that would suggest that she viewed him as any kind of suspect, which again is very strange. Overall, she really just operated off of vague stereotypes of cultures she just didn't understand. On February 12th, a very convenient anonymous tip was called into police that told them to investigate Adnan for the murder. It was marked down as 2 calls from an Asian male ages 18 to 21. The caller said to focus on Hae's boyfriend Adnan, and that Adnan said that if he ever killed his girlfriend, that he would drive her car into a lake. A lot of incorrect information was given in this call. The caller said Adnan and Hae had hooked up at Leakin Park when they didn't. There was no evidence to suggest they were ever out there. They also said that Hae had broken up with Adnan a week prior, but it was more like over a month before that. I kind of call BS on this call completely. They were clearly already focusing on Adnan, and this was likely either a ploy from police to justify their witch hunt, or the actual killer deflecting maybe, or it might just be the police being too stupid to actually do their job and keep investigating. They just wanted a reason to point in one direction.
Tips are always so vital to cases too, that you know, like they always say, like, we dived into all the tips, we got so many here and there and yada yada yada, but here they literally were like, if it doesn't have to do with Adnan, we don't want to talk to you, we don't want to hear about it, we don't want to report it, and we don't want to file anything that has to do with anything other than him.
Yeah, and just dismissing the tip that came from the man who actually walked into the police station. You know, he would put his face to it. He wanted to tell them in person, thought it was significant enough to go out of his way to go there and tell them about it. That was nothing, but some anonymous person that wouldn't even put their name to it had just decided that it was Adnan, even though a lot of the information was incorrect, and they just never looked away from that. Around this time, police got Adnan's cell records, and they would actually subpoena these records twice, which is interesting. From these records, they found a girl named Jennifer Pusateri. She was one of the most called on Adnan's records, and so they brought her in for an interview. She's kind of the initial person to lay out a series of events that would kind of be molded into the official story as told by police and prosecutors later. She said that Jay approached her and asked her to help him get rid of evidence of the murder of Hae. And in this, they also implicated Adnan as being the murderer. The story was basically that Adnan had premeditated the murder on Hae because he was mad at her for breaking up with him, and that he killed her in a Best Buy parking lot, then put her in the trunk of his car and went to get Jay to help him dispose of the body. Police brought Jay in, and right off the bat, his story was extremely contradictory. He was changing it constantly. Every time he told the story, basically, different details came out, other details disappeared. He'd be in different places, different parking lots, just all of it's so different. They ended up taking Jay in a police car, and they went around to try to, quote unquote, find Hae's car. Initially, he took them to the wrong place, and then they ended up finding her car. This story was super suspect to me, especially with him taking them to the wrong place first. Hae's plates were actually run 6 times in the 2 weeks after her disappearance, but because Adcock hadn't put her car information into the system, it really wasn't ever connected. But it suggests that police may have known where the car was beforehand and kind of led Jay to it, and we'll get more into the car in a second. It wasn't even until February 10th that the VIN number for Hae's car was put in, and even then they did it incorrectly, so again, it didn't really help in finding her. In Hae's car, the police found a note that they believed to be from the day that she went missing. It looked like it was to Dawn, saying that she had a wrestling match to go to at a different high school, and she also talked about an interview that she had that day, and she mentioned that she had recorded it so he could watch it whenever he wanted. They used this to develop a series of events that day, but in reality, this note was from a week before, so it had nothing to do with the day that she disappeared at all. Forensically on the car, nothing was right with it pretty much. There was grass on the tires that was still green. Remember, supposedly it had been sitting out there for 6 weeks, so that grass should have been long dead. The grass underneath the car was also green and looked fresh, but in surrounding spaces, there were patches of dead grass, like rectangular patches of dead grass where cars had been sitting for extended periods of time. So for 6 weeks, it's strange that this didn't happen under Hae's car. The car was also not in a good neighborhood, and most of the surrounding cars had extra locks on the steering wheels to prevent theft. Hae's car had no such protection, and it was completely untouched, even with some expensive things inside. So it was sitting there for 6 weeks in a neighborhood known for break-ins, and nothing was touched at all. Also, no one in the neighborhood reported it at all for those 6 weeks, even though to them it would have been a suspicious car just sitting there. The windshield wiper lever in the car was kind of detached from the steering column, and Jay said that this was evidence that Hae had been killed in the driver's seat and in her struggle had kicked it and broken it. But upon more thorough investigation, they found that this had actually been taken off. So it wasn't broken. There was no snapped plastic or anything. It was taken off, and the steering column cover was taken off as well. And there was evidence that the car had either been attempted to be or successfully hot-wired at some point, and there were no keys on the site. So all of this kind of adds up to suggest that the car was not sitting there the entire 6 weeks, that it was placed there fairly recently before it was found. We don't know where else it could have been or anything like that, but it's another very suspicious part. People that know this case well probably know about the Nisha call, and I've seen a lot of people who think that Adnan is guilty use this as evidence too, but even this is super shaky. Nisha was a friend of Adnan, and supposedly Nisha received a call during school hours when, remember, Jay had borrowed Adnan's car, which also had his cell phone in it because they weren't allowed to have cell phones in school. So this kind of stands to reason that it was kind of a mistake or maybe a butt dial. Nisha said that she recalled talking to Jay briefly one time when Adnan was on the phone with her, and police kind of took this to be the day of the murder. But according to evidence, it didn't actually happen that day. Nisha said that she had only talked to Jay that one time, and that it was while Adnan was visiting him at a video store that he worked at. But Jay didn't start working here until 2 weeks after Hae went missing. So this is another huge contradiction. It really doesn't make sense because She said that she had only talked to him that one time, and just the nature of mentioning the video store doesn't put it anywhere around the time that Hae went missing.
On February 28th, Adnan was arrested. Police interrogated him without parents there, even though his attorney was trying to see him and trying to get the interview recorded. This is something Brittany is really familiar with, called the Reed technique, so I'm going to let her explain that a little bit real quick.
Yeah, so the Reed technique we talked about a little bit with the Juan Rivera case, but it's basically a technique that's taught to law enforcement about how to interrogate people. And the way Rabia described the interrogation here is classic with that. And it's really an ineffective technique. It doesn't have any basis in psychology or anything. It's just meant to get people to say whatever the police want them to say and take whatever means necessary to do it, pretty much.
Brittany made a good point too, that if you honestly think that you have the right person who committed the crime, why not follow the ethical and the proper way to complete the investigation and the interrogation and the court trials and collecting evidence? If you're sure that you're right, why take dirty routes to get it done? You shouldn't need to do that. It should already be pretty much there for you. Your job should be handed to you at that point if you have what you need to have. Honestly, it's really hard to understand what goes through the minds of officers in this case, but it really makes you wonder if they're doing it with malicious intent, or if they're really just not interested in justice and more interested in numbers and stats and getting the results that they want and taking the quote-unquote easy way rather than getting down to the point. A lot of people who think Adnan is guilty think that it's just unreasonable to consider that so many people could be doing negative things to point the fingers at him rather than really getting down to the truth. But this stuff happens all the time. We have so many wrongful conviction cases and so many times that police manipulate evidence. You can go look at the Innocence Project and see hundreds, It's definitely not something abnormal, but I think because Adnan's case is so popular that a lot of people who may not be as familiar with wrongful convictions or as familiar with ways that police can manipulate evidence and information can easily say that this is something of a unique circumstance, even if it's not.
Yeah, one thing I've seen a lot in reading about this case and different people's opinions, I've seen so many people say, oh, if he is innocent, then he's just the unluckiest guy in the world. And to that, I just go back to thinking about Juan Rivera, who was convicted 3 times for a crime that he did not commit before he was exonerated. So maybe they were really unlucky. Maybe anyone who's wrongfully convicted is really unlucky, but it happens. It's not an unheard of thing.
And it's not just the police officers who are contributing to this case in a negative way. I mean, yes, some of them are trained badly and they also cover for their own very frequently, but lawyers sometimes can't be bothered by the prospect that they have people's lives at their hands. They get numb to the fact that their job is very important and everything that they do is going to affect someone's life. When the bail hearing occurred, it was pretty easily seen as bias. Vicky Wash came in with racial stereotyping, saying that Adnan had really strong ties to Pakistan and he would just flee, and this is why his bail should be denied because there's a pattern for this. And even though this one case that she was referencing to where a guy did flee, she decided to take that into an ambiguous term and just say that it happened all the time. However, Adnan is not a Pakistani citizen and he was even born in America. She apologized later and basically admitted that she was just being racist. Also, they decided to use an incorrect birthday, which is insane and should be if it's not illegal. They were trying to charge Adnan as an adult, so they put him in as 18 rather than 17, and this problem is not fixed. Instead of trying to debunk the evidence that didn't line up with their story, police basically just tried to ruin the character of anyone that spoke against what they believed to be the correct narrative. A very important person in this entire case is Asia Maclean. Shortly after Adnan was arrested, Asia reached out to him and wrote him a letter. She said that she remembered seeing him that day and talked to him at the library surrounding the time in question. She specifically remembers this because she was going to meet up with her boyfriend and the storm was happening, so the school was closing, and so she just chatted with Adnan for a little bit. This is insane. This is an alibi for Adnan, and Just 2 or 3 minutes of some sort of alibi for Adnan completely throws off the time constraints around how this murder could have happened.
Yeah, if Asia's telling the truth, it completely blows the police's story of events away 100%.
She even visited Adnan's family and figured that him being arrested was just some misunderstanding because she had obviously seen him, so she knows that he wasn't committing any heinous crimes at the time. Adnan passed this information along to his new lawyer, Cristina Gutierrez, who told him that she had followed up with Asia, but that she had her dates wrong and there was nothing really that Asia could do to help. Asia was then, once again, like everyone else in this freaking case, was dismissed.
This time by his own lawyer.
Cristina Gutierrez started representing Adnan as a lawyer in the first trial. She was not the best lawyer, needless to say. She is really confusing and long-winded from the very beginning. The first trial was ultimately rough. She was good back in the day, but she started having a rapid decline a few years prior to Adnan's case, and this continued all the way up to her death. So the whole time she was representing him, she wasn't in a good mindset. She was so long-winded, the judge repeatedly had to ask her to hurry it along, or he would have to cut her off, which just makes her look a little silly in front of the jury. And I'm sure that the jury was lost many times when she started rambling and seemingly asking irrelevant questions. She boofed a lot in this case. She would go on and on about things that had nothing to do with it, and missed major opportunities to catch people in lies and establish certain facts about Adnan that would benefit him.
Unfortunately, in trials, it's a lot of times more about kind of theater and psychology over thorough analysis of the facts. So the prosecution being short and to the point and confident in what they were saying really overshadowed Gutierrez's weird 50-minute rambling introduction and irrelevant questioning and all of that. It just didn't make her look good and didn't make her look confident in the case.
Also, as Rabia puts it, Gutierrez otherized Adnan, which shot her own self in the foot with the case, making him seem a part of some far-off extreme religion and culture instead of just a kid that was trying to do right by what his family believed to be traditional religion and family values. Gutierrez was missing opportunity after opportunity to effectively cross-examine people. She did manage to confirm that the medical examiner can't really say an exact time of death, which is something important to note because everything is based on this short amount of time that Adnan had to be able to commit this murder. So if the time of death doesn't add up, then Adnan's guilt could come into question. However, she disregarded the entirety of Asia's whole statement and doesn't even bring it up in court as evidence. Even though she told Adnan that Asia had the day wrong, she did not. This seems more like a tactic for Gutierrez to just not have to worry about another chunk of evidence, kind of like pushing off some of her job responsibilities instead of taking the initiative to provide this really good evidence that may make or break the case.
The first trial was really a mess completely. Gutierrez was so laughably ineffective that it was just absurd. And a lot of times she just sort of played into the prosecution's story without really trying to. The double life thing comes up constantly in this case, but I would say almost every teenager is leading a quote-unquote double life to some degree. If your definition is really that he was doing things that his parents didn't know about or that were frowned upon in his religion. Most teenagers likely don't tell their parents everything they've ever done. Most people don't tell everyone they know everything they've ever done. So to have things that your parents don't know or that your work friends don't know or that your church friends don't know is not uncommon.
Honestly, Brittany and I have been friends for like 2 years and we've been attached at the hip ever since we met. And there's still days that we'll just be hanging out and all of a sudden Brittany will say something. I'm like, what the heck? That's so important. Why have I never known that? And she's like, well, yeah, whatever. And I'm like, well, what?
Yeah. So it's just not everyone you know knows everything you've ever done. And that's not a double life. It's not like he was driving to the next town over to a wife and 3 kids that no one knew about. He was a teenager doing normal teenager stuff, dating and drinking and smoking pot. And if Islam was not involved in this, there would be no mention of it at all. It wouldn't be a double life. It wouldn't be anything. It would just be a normal teenager doing normal teenage stuff. Adnan was involved in his community. He was involved with his parents. He was involved in the church. He was in sports. He did well in school. He had goals for the future. He wasn't leading a double life. He was just a teenager. And Adnan's parents knew about Hae. They had been caught multiple times. And so even though they weren't happy about it, it wasn't like they had no inkling that Adnan was dating or flirting with girls or talking to girls on the phone. Where is this double life thing coming from? In another huge timeline discrepancy, a girl named Christina Vincent testified that Adnan was at her house one day after she had been at a conference. She remembers the cops calling Adnan. This would be one of the first times that cops contacted Adnan, and she remembered he got really freaked out and left. Adnan said he had been by her house, but was almost positive that it had not been that night. Also, the conference that Christina said that she had been at had not been that day at all. So the timeline just, again, does not add up. Interestingly enough, Christina's house was convenient in the cop's story because it aligned with cell phone pings, even though it didn't really fit into the story otherwise. Also interesting about the cell phone records, police only subpoenaed the phone records of Muslim people involved with Adnan. So again, this puts religion at the center of this case when it really shouldn't have been. The jury even asked questions that made it clear that they knew that this was speculated to be a religious-based murder, which just kind of misses the point. Jay contradicts himself over and over and has really cryptic answers in this trial that don't really answer anything. He had about 3 different stories about where the trunk pop, where supposedly Adnan showed Jay Hae's body. Jay changes from Adnan calling him the night before to not saying anything until after lending him the car. And pretty much each major witness of the story left out some major details that another would say. Between Jay, Jennifer Pusateri, and Jay's girlfriend Stephanie, the stories really don't share all of the details, which you would think in something that important that at least major things would come up in each person's story, but they really didn't. Prosecutor Kevin Urich asked Jay why he changed his story so much to kind of get ahead of it because his main witness was a liar, basically. So he asked about why the trunk pop location changed all over the place. And Jay said, quote, "Really, there was no reason. I just felt more comfortable if the cops had returned me to a place I felt comfortable in," end quote. Which, what does that even mean? That means nothing. And they never asked to clarify that statement. He never was just like, that makes no sense. Can you say something that makes sense? It was just dropped. I think this is one majorly telling thing. In Jay's weird cryptic answers to Urich about why his story kept changing, he said that he didn't want Jen to have to be questioned or involved, which, if you believe the police version of events, Jay was only picked up and talked to for the first time based on Jen's statements. So she was involved before he was. So it's kind of interesting that he said he didn't want Jen involved, and that's why he wouldn't tell them the truth at first when she was already involved and he knew this.
Inconsistencies.
This might even be evidence that the police talked to Jay much sooner than they let on, which, if you've read the book, there's quite a bit of evidence about that. So that's interesting. The first trial took an even weirder turn when Cristina Gutierrez became upset when she said she hadn't seen some cell records that had been admitted. They had a meeting with the judge, and she basically said that it wasn't fair to include this information because she hadn't seen it. And the prosecutor said, you have the documents, like you could have looked at it. And Christina said that she had agreed to admit them because she didn't care at that point, but that she hadn't ever read them. This is such a strange fight for her to have. And even though when they're having these kind of side meetings, there's a white noise machine going on, so the jury doesn't hear. In this case, they did hear it, and the jury mentioned to the judge that they had heard Gutierrez being called a liar, basically. And this basically blew up the trial, and it ended in a mistrial. This was so frustrating, as some jury members were kind of questioned a little bit after, and most of them said that they would have acquitted him based on what had been presented so far. Even with Gutierrez's hot mess of a defense case and terrible delivery, the other evidence that had been presented was just weak enough that maybe if she hadn't been so careless and combative, that Adnan would have been free at that point. Obviously, all of the evidence wasn't presented yet, so it's hard to say for sure, but it was definitely in Adnan's favor at this point, and ending this in a mistrial really messed things up. Not to mention that hearing that the jury would have most likely acquitted Adnan, his family and supporters kind of took this as a sign that Gutierrez was on the right track and was capable of continuing, when in reality she really should have been kicked off the case entirely, if not completely disbarred. Also, this really sucked because it gave the prosecution the perfect dry run. They saw exactly what was working and what wasn't working and how to kind of tweak things to put it more in their favor. Ultimately, this case was really won or lost by Gutierrez at this point, and she messed it up so royally.
When the second trial started, Uric came in with the bang. He knew exactly how to hit the weak points of the case, and he was much more effective. He would manipulate the jury and people who were listening in on the case, talking about how Jay is poor and had a rough upbringing and how this may make you not like him, but that's all just manipulative, trying to make you think that if you don't like Jay or you don't agree with him, that you're just biased against poor people and that you're an awful person, basically. Also, it makes Jay seem like a pathetic victim that was handpicked because he was some shitty person and no one would believe him. This is ridiculous too, because he's obviously not a victim. He was an accessory to murder if everything he was saying is true, and if it's not, he's a liar and he's committing perjury. Since Adnan was Muslim and had kind of a different culture, the jury was not primarily his peers, and so it was easy for them to paint Adnan as an outsider with this Romeo and Juliet story, rather than painting him as this normal kid who was doing normal things and just trying to have a balanced life with a good future, and also trying to meet his family's and cultural expectations. The prosecutors were very well spoken and very well organized and laid out and methodical, but Gutierrez was very nonsensical, and her closing arguments just didn't stand a chance, not even slightly.
Honestly, her closing arguments were one of the craziest things I've ever seen. I've read a lot of court transcripts, and it's absurd.
Doesn't make sense at all.
Literal nonsense. Like, she would start a sentence and then she would trail off. She'd go into something else. She'd like make half of a point here and there, and then she would go off on weird tangents. Like, if you haven't read anything else, you should go try to find that, because it is just so bizarre.
Also, Uric said that it took 15 seconds to kill Hae, which doesn't really make sense. A lot of us true crime addicts know that 15 seconds to strangle someone and beat someone, that's just illogical. It just doesn't make sense. Strangling someone alone can take minutes. Ultimately, Adnan was found guilty at the end of the second trial. Afterwards, Rabia found out that Gutierrez lied to Adnan about talking to Asia.
That must have been such a huge gut punch to find out something that massive.
I can't imagine. Definitely at the end of a second trial. 2 trials, you just found out that such vital information wasn't even addressed by the lawyer who was supposed to be doing her job by addressing it. Adnan decided to file an appeal for ineffective assistance of counsel. He had his date set and everything was going smoothly, but he started having some problems that impacted him physically, and he had to undergo a surgery. The thing with being in prison is they don't really tell you the surgery dates in advance because, convicts could plan escapes or plan attacks or things like that. So they don't tell them, but for some freaking odd reason, they scheduled the surgery on the same day as his appeal date. Once the day came and Adnan found out, they made him testify at his appeal instead of getting the surgery, and he had to just do it under his physically demanding condition. I know that they can't tell him the date, but it's just insane that they would even allow this to happen. I feel that the court has to be in contact with the jail, and such big things as surgery and appeals should be communicated more efficiently if they are not already. If this was a personal attack on Adnan, then that's just so shitty, honestly. At the end of the appeal, they just dismissed it. They said that Adnan was properly assisted by his attorney. They said there wasn't enough evidence to prove that she had counseled him improperly in any sort of way or even fumbled anything, which doesn't make a lot of sense. As we've talked about, she fumbled a lot. They also said that there was no reason to believe that Asia would have even been a good alibi witness, which is a load of malarkey. They also said that Adnan's testimony contradicted Asia's statements, and that also doesn't make a lot of sense. These sort of things could have easily been sorted out if it was just brought to court. According to Uric, Asia wanted no part of the appeal. He said that he had briefly spoken to her, and Asia told him that the family had coerced her into writing the letter. This would later be stated as a total lie. He lied to the court. Asia never changed her story, and she was never coerced. Asia was also lied to by Uric because he said that there was irrefutable solid evidence that Adnan was guilty, basically just saying that she didn't even need to concern herself with coming in because there was no point. Uric was never punished for this, even though this is clearly committing perjury, and finding out about this lie came too late to be able to help in the appeal. The judge clearly just didn't care about the case. Adnan really felt like being instructed to never talk about the case or reach out to people hurt his case so much to a place where he couldn't even repair it anymore. And his decision to cut off from the outside world just dug that in deeper. So many people thought that he was guilty because he wasn't saying anything and they hadn't heard from him after his arrest, but it was really just his attorney telling him to be quiet, and he regrets that.
After this appeal, things were looking really grim for Adnan, and Rabia was trying to grasp at whatever she could to bring the case some exposure. So she reached out to Sarah Koenig of This American Life, and she agreed to do a podcast on it, which became Serial. Most of you have probably heard Serial, so we won't rehash the entire series. Definitely go listen to it if you haven't. But mainly the series was trying to expose new information and uncover some things. And Sarah did uncover some good things and brought them up in the case. Personally, from listening to Serial, I feel like Sarah thought she could really break the case open, and kind of by the end she realized that she couldn't, and her enthusiasm with it kind of declined a little bit. And by the end, I feel like she had either convinced herself that Adnan was guilty or that he couldn't be helped or whatever that she had in her mind, but she really couldn't commit one way or another in the final episodes, and she left out some major information in the podcast as well. I feel like on the one hand, Serial did a lot of good things for Adnan's case. It also really sparked true crime podcasts being a mainstream thing, and I feel like a lot of good came from it, but I think it also kind of harmed Adnan's case a little bit with some of the wrong attention and some manipulated information that was more for sensationalism than justice. Rabia mentions in the book realizing that she and Sarah are not on the same team, and even though Rabia prompted Serial to be made, she had a lot of issues with some of the things that Sarah was doing. She didn't always agree with her decisions or the stuff she decided to share or not share. Some of these things included Sarah concluding that the cops were ultimately good. I think this shows an implicit bias on her part, as many people have, or at least had at that time. A lot of people think that all cops are good people, just trained to do good things and help people, and that any situation that opposes that idea is just chalked up to mistakes instead of being trained poorly or being rewarded for bad behavior or just corruption and misconduct in general. Baltimore County is known far and wide for being extremely corrupt, so the kind of bumbling cop bit doesn't really play there. To say the cops did nothing wrong in this case is basically saying that racism and lying and manipulating evidence are not wrong, which is kind of telling of the person saying that. The cops involved, Ritz and McGillivray, and other people that were involved in this case too, have been part of other wrongful conviction cases and even have been found to be directly involved in a lot of nefarious dealings. So that in itself shows the character of them. And again, I bring up the Juan Rivera case. He was convicted 3 times. So many people came together to make that happen, and he was exonerated. So clearly there's more at play than just a mistake here or there. Sarah also cut parts of Adnan expressing his betrayal by Cristina Gutierrez. In the podcast, she only played his praises to her, which in reality, that was his initial feeling on her when she first started representing him. He was just thankful that she was there, and he thought she was great. But remember, he was just a kid, and he really had no idea what was going on at that point. But Sarah opted not to include the parts where Adnan realized that Gutierrez was not helping him, that he was not being represented well. She just completely left that out, which basically made it sound like Adnan was defending Gutierrez and not at all upset with the way she handled his case.
I remember whenever I listened to Serial, this was the first time I'd ever gotten a touch of what Adnan Syed's case was, or Hae Min Lee's case. And I remember listening to it all and I was like, Gutierrez doesn't sound that bad. And then whenever Brittany talked to me about it afterwards, she was like, no, like Gutierrez was not good. And that just shows, like, from me personally, even I had that kind of outlook whenever I finished the Serial podcast. And after doing, reading this and watching documentaries and so on and so forth, having discussions, you just realize that it isn't what it was all cracked up to be in Serial.
Definitely. And that's a great example of how sharing certain things and not others can really manipulate people into feeling one way or another. And
I mean, they do that type of stuff all the time on the news. They center what they want you to know and how they want you to feel about that by how they say it and what they show you from it. They do the exact same thing in politics because they want you to hear what they want you to hear. It's really crazy how easy it is to manipulate those kind of platforms.
This kind of thing shows me that Sarah was not really concerned with true journalism or even justice some of the time. She was okay with manipulating information, manipulating her audience into feeling one way or another. Again, I think it was a lot about sensationalism and notoriety, and whether she was just focusing on the entertainment of the show rather than the justice, or she was actively trying to like spin a certain narrative. I don't really know, but there were a lot of things that she just completely left out. She presented information about Adnan supposedly stealing thousands of dollars from collection plates at the mosque when that couldn't have happened. And he admitted to stealing a little bit of money here and there, but not thousands. It was like $20 here and there. She basically completely left out Jay's troubled past, and she also left out Jay directly calling Sarah. That was a really weird part of the book that I hadn't heard before. That Jay called Sarah and threatened her and was screaming at her, and then he hung up, and then she called him back and he pretended like that never happened, even though it was obviously his voice, obviously the same words that he was saying. And he just, when she talked to him the second time, he was just like, I didn't call you, even though it was his number, his voice, his words. It just But she never shared that, and kind of led people to believe that Jay wasn't really that bad, that he had no reason to lie, he had no bad past, that he didn't have a pattern of just crazy behavior. Thankfully, with some things, Sarah changed her tune on that a little bit. She didn't really right her past wrongs, but towards the end, she decided not to share information about Asia and new developments with that when they realized that Urich had completely lied, again, committed perjury. But Sarah really sacrificed that huge break for the integrity of Adnan's case in that instance, so at least we can be thankful for that. Overall, Sarah really coddled both the police and Gutierrez during the podcast, and whether she was just super naive or actively trying to manipulate the audience to feel one way or another, or for more sensationalism or whatever it was, is unclear. But it's just kind of sad that she had that amazing platform and she didn't really share a lot of the evidence. Gutierrez didn't just fumble Adnan's case. She had other clients that she was doing terrible work for. She ignored a lot of vital evidence. She made that terrible impression in court. She was even embezzling money from her law firm. She was awful to the families. If you hear Rabia describe their interactions with Gutierrez, she was just awful to them. She just kept trying to get more money for this and that, and she didn't care at all about justice or even just doing a good job, even just for her own preservation. She just didn't care. So to look at that and kind of reach Sarah's conclusion that she did her best, she was just bad at business, I can't deal with that. Sarah did later inform Rabia about this cultural research memo that someone had created. Their name was blacked out on it, so Rabia couldn't see because they were scared of backlash, which this cultural research memo was used in the trials to kind of build a background on the case, and it contained pretty much nothing but racism, xenophobia, and just bullshit. this being released just proved how big a role religion played in this case and how focused they were on this being a religious motivated killing, some kind of honor killing, and just completely misrepresenting everything about Adnan. Later, it was uncovered that this memo was written by none other than Mandy Johnson, who literally had no qualifications to be an authority on anything Muslim or pretty much anything at all. During Serial, Rabia posted a blog of her own, sharing her opinions on the episodes, other information they found out, kind of her issues with what Sarah was saying. Sometimes they even had big fights about information shared on one or the other.
Yeah, you learn from the book that they have a love-hate kind of relationship throughout this whole process.
Yeah, definitely. And through Rabia's blog, she found a lot of other people that were kind of analyzing the case and talking about it. So she started building a community of people who could really help her do the things that she couldn't do by herself. She connected with another lawyer, Susan Simpson, who had analyzed some of the evidence and had a really thorough take on it, and Rabia really appreciated that. So she gave Susan Simpson access to all the files on the case so she could go through and help Rabia figure things out. And she found some other people to help her with other elements of it too. And that's kind of what led to Undisclosed. They were really trying to get the Innocence Project to look at Adnan's case, but they had been denied because there wasn't DNA in it. Thankfully, one of the good parts of Serial is that she got them to reevaluate and agree to look into it. The kicker was this happened because there were samples in the case that should have been tested but never were. So this is kind of when they found out that there was DNA and that it had never been tested, which is another bombshell.
After Serial, there was some more investigation that they did, and they found the proof with the cell cover sheet and the cell records not matching Jay's story, and they had pretty strong evidence that Jay was being coached by the police. Jay's story would contain incorrect information that the police had that they believed to be true, and then whenever they found out that it wasn't true and that they had the wrong information, suddenly Jay's story would change as well. For example, the map was wrong and Jay's story matched the wrong map, but once they found out that the map was wrong, all of a sudden Jay's story changed as well to match the new map. So that's kind of suspicious in itself. Not to mention that they realized once listening to some of the interrogation tapes that you'll hear Jay talking and all of a sudden he kind of stops and you'll hear a little tap, tap, tap. I don't know if you could hear that on my mic or not, but you'll hear like a little tap and then he'll say, "Oh, right." And he'll talk about whatever the tap was. There was also a line from the book that Jay says, "Pops? Oh yeah, Adnan popped the trunk." Like he was wondering what that word meant out loud and then was like, "Oh yeah, that's right. Adnan popped the trunk. Thanks for reminding me," Rabia
kind of theorizes in the book that this is because that this all kind of started because they got phone records that showed Adnan's name and they basically decided that he was it. And when they realized that Jay had Adnan's phone and not Adnan, then they kind of had to scramble to put the pieces back together to the case. So that would explain why Jay needed to be led so much and why his story kept changing and why there are these little pieces that kind of suggested he was literally being led to read a script, basically.
Not to mention that it's believed that Jay got the $3,000 reward money for his testimony. He was addressed about this by, I believe it was Rabia and maybe another person who kind of addressed Jay about this, and he didn't deny it when he was asked, but he also had bought himself a new car, which is kind of strange for his circumstances at the time. So this led them to believe that he received that $3,000 reward and just was told to keep hush about it. People also were writing online and approaching Rabia about their insights, just like Susan Simpson had, and a woman came forward about discovering some inconsistencies with the livor mortis. Livor mortis has to do with the way that the blood pools in the body when it sits in one position after death. In Hae's case, the prosecution's version of events put Hae in the trunk of the car and then in the woods. Her body showed that the blood had pooled evenly along the front of her body, but when she was found, she was laying on her right side and supposedly had been dumped there soon after her death. The actual evidence suggests that she was kept face down for a number of hours and then moved. She would have had to have been flat, not scrunched up in the car trunk. So this doesn't correlate at all. The livor mortis in her body is a physical indication that the story does not add up. Which once again is another thing that if they would have just collected the evidence and done the interrogation and processing of the crime scene accurately, then this wouldn't have even been a problem.
Yeah, they really picked a suspect and then made the rest of the evidence fit that instead of the other way around.
And it's such a shame in this case because if they would have just done it the right way, this could have been an easy solve.
Yeah, not only would Adnan be free, but the actual person who did it could have been apprehended.
And I know that the family of Hae Min Lee believe that Adnan did it and think that Hae has justice, but personally, I think Brittany and I both can say that we don't think that Hae's family has the justice it deserves right now, and we don't think that Adnan is getting the justice he deserves.
Absolutely. I think Hae's family was manipulated just like a lot of other people in this case, and obviously they want it to be solved. They want it to be over. I think that was played on, and unfortunately, I just don't think justice has been served at all.
Yeah, sadly, Hae's family and Hae herself will not get justice until Adnan does too. In December of 2014, Jay was interviewed in The Intercept, and here he basically tosses out the entire original story and changes huge details about this case. In addition to admitting to perjury, he also showed yet again that he couldn't keep things straight. Maybe since he didn't have someone tapping a piece of paper and keeping him on track, lost his train of thought. If this new version of events is true, it really doesn't track with what was presented in trial at all, which means even then, even if you want to believe Jay, the whole trial is tossed out. There was something really interesting that also was brought up where it was this strange dream that a woman had. They called it like a sidekick, but the girl herself was like, I'm not a sidekick. I just had this really vivid, strange dream. And it's very unsettling, but she talks about how she was there in this car and this young Korean girl was in the car and something very terrible had happened. And she described the man who was in the car who matched some details to someone. And she talks about how this man started strangling this young girl and she was confused and she didn't know why this was happening. She didn't think for a second that she was going to die. And supposedly the man didn't intend on killing her. And in her dream, the man put the young girl in the trunk and then drove back to his house. He went inside for a few hours and then went back out and dumped her body in the woods. Supposedly when he dumped her body, the woman said that she could feel Hae's loneliness and sadness and confusion, even though she was already deceased. And she woke up that night in like a sweat and went to the police and was like, I had this dream and like, it's insane. And you know that if it was strong enough for her to feel to go to the police about it, that's something pretty substantial, definitely, since she doesn't consider herself to even be like a sidekick. It's not like she's like, I had this and I know it was a vision. She just felt so concerned about whatever just happened that she felt she needed to tell someone in law enforcement. So that's pretty strong feelings of emotion, and you have to wonder if what she said has something behind it, because not to throw shade or anything, but what she says matches with all the evidence more than what Jay says.
Honestly, yeah, that was a really eerie part of the book and pretty crazy aspect to a really crazy case.
Yeah, after listening to the podcasts and listening to documentaries and whatnot, it was something that I had actually never heard of. So when that part happened at the end of the book, I was like, wait, what?
So that's basically the end of the story itself. And once again, I just want to say that this was not an exhaustive look at every single fact in this case. There's a lot more to it. Like Hallie said, the book was really long, had a lot of information, and there's more information past that. So I highly recommend keeping this book on hand and kind of flipping through when you need clarification on certain things, definitely listen to Undisclosed. That goes into a lot, including having recordings of Jay, and you can hear the tapping and things like that. And just do your own research. Really dive into this case. This is one of those that needs smart people looking at it. A lot of people have reached out to Rabia and given her really good information. Susan Simpson and other people involved in Undisclosed. Even the livor mortis tip was by someone that was following the story. So this is one of those where intelligent input is so helpful and really is cracking this case, which is so exciting. Also, I highly recommend donating to Adnan's legal fund. It's a lot of money to have all these appeals and all these different court proceedings. So check that out. There's also a Facebook group that is run by friends of Adnan, and we get updates there sometimes and people talking about the case. So that's really good if you want to sort of be amongst people that are really fighting for Adnan to get justice. Now we're going to jump into just a few opinions on the book itself. I really loved how Rabia included descriptions of the culture. I feel like this case was so full of stereotypes of Muslims, and that played such a huge role that it was really cool to have it kind of explained more and have her include sort of differences in culture and how all of that really fit together instead of just the stereotypes.
I agree. I noticed that right off the bat, like right at the beginning of the book, that she was talking a lot about her religion and the culture and her culture. And so it really made you feel more connected. And I personally love learning about like other people's cultures and the way that they live and their traditions and their family values and things like that. So I thought it was really interesting. And it also made you able to understand the situation that Adnan was in much more efficiently than if you were to just assume that he was held to the same standards and traditions as someone of another religion or another culture.
It really provided a good look into Adnan's family and how they functioned, kind of his parents' history and the community's history and cultural expectations and how they differed. It wasn't really one rigid set of standards. Like, his father was a little bit more lenient about certain things. His mother was concerned about other things. And I think it was really interesting to hear about the community and how in the culture kind of airing people's dirty laundry was really against their morals and standards. So that really showed you how much such a publicized trial about, you know, this supposed honor killing and sex and all this stuff, how that really harmed the community and how people really didn't want to be involved in that because it's just not part of their culture, where there's a lot of other cultures where gossip is kind of the norm. The book was also written in a way that was really easy to follow. I feel like it flowed really well, even though it was a very complicated case. And there was a lot of things where you would learn one thing and then later she would circle back to that and you would figure out it was a complete lie or that the information was different or anything like that. So I think that she kept that flow really well.
Yeah, which I feel like was really hard to do. Like, you know, she would talk about Dawn at the beginning and then she'd talk about it at the end. And it's easy to feel like everything's kind of scattered even when we were making notes about this case, it seemed so scattered and cluttered because we were kind of like jotting down facts. But the flow of the book, the way she really like leads into the next detail and that leads into the next one, even if it's something that kind of could be looped back up to something said before, she still made it flow with fluidity.
The book also really described what the family went through after the conviction and how each member was hurt and affected and how Adnan was hurt and affected. And it was so sad to hear Adnan talk about how worried he was about being seen as a manipulator. It seemed like that was one of the most traumatic parts for him in this whole thing, was not just losing a friend, not just being falsely accused of something horrific, but being labeled as this person that could do all these terrible things and manipulate people into thinking that he's a good person. Like, basically his entire life was a lie. That's what he was being told, that like his kindness, his compassion and desire to do good and help his family and help his community, that was all just a lie. He also talked about his frustration with people saying like, oh, you seem nice, you could never have done this, or whatever kind of superficial reason they had that he didn't commit the murder, instead of looking at the facts of the case. And this is something I've thought about a lot, and I've talked to people a lot about. I think both sides really use that justification as like, oh, he seems too nice to do something like that. Or the other side being like, oh, that niceness is just manipulation and he's really this terrible person. But if you just disregard his character completely and look at the facts, it just doesn't add up. It doesn't matter if he's a good person or a bad person, honestly. It just doesn't add up. When I finished Serial for the first time, I definitely thought Adnan was innocent. But more than that, I remember discussing this with my mom, who also listened. But you can't tell someone's capability on whether or not they're likable or nice. There's lots of people in my life that seem great, that have done things that I wouldn't have thought possible. So you just can't base it on that. And especially in these cases, like, most of us don't know Adnan personally, so you're hearing his character third or fourth hand sometimes. Yes, he seems like a really nice person. He's very compassionate. He's very worried about his family, and everything that he does really makes him seem like a good person. But at the end of the day, that doesn't really matter, because it's the facts of the case that really are going to bring him justice, and not whether he's likable or not. So I really understand his frustration with that point and how kind of bummed out he gets when people say stuff like that. Not that it's a bad thing, and he said it's not a bad thing, but it's just people kind of focusing on superficial things rather than the massive mountain of evidence that just doesn't align. But that's something that really stuck with me, of how many things stacked up in this case that just didn't make sense and that weren't right, and how many people failed to do their job, to uphold their oaths, and just bare minimum be ethical or just be a decent person. And at the end of the day, you can be 99% sure he's innocent, or even 10% sure he's innocent, and still look at that trial, look at the investigation, look at Gutierrez, look at all of this stuff, and see that he did not get a fair trial. And that's really the main issue.
Yeah, whether he's guilty or not, if you want to believe that he's guilty, if you want to believe that he's innocent, the thing that's important is he didn't get a fair trial. So he deserves at least a new trial with all of the proper evidence brought forward. And if he is still considered guilty after that, then that's one thing. But if he's brought all of the information that he should be during the trial, and the prosecutors play a fair game, and the lawyers play a fair game, do the job they're supposed to do, and all of the stuff is brought forward the way it should be brought forward, and he's proven innocent.
Yeah, you should be able to take any one piece of this case, whether it's the livor mortis, you're committing perjury and never facing consequences for it, the cell phone data being manipulated, Jay's story being insane and having a billion versions.
And the tapping thing is pretty recently discovered, so who knows where that's going to go necessarily, but that in itself should be brought up as a concern.
Yeah, any one of these things should be enough to completely dismantle the case, but we'll have to see. This case has meant a lot to me over the years. It was kind of my first true crime podcast experience, and although before that I had watched a lot of true crime shows and stuff, I think that was one of the first times it really hit me how terrible the system is, and
she's never stopped since.
And that was just from Serial, which we've established is a little bit biased and didn't include all the information. So I really jumped into this case after that and read up, spent a lot of time on message boards and blogs and all kinds of stuff like that.
Reading books, court documents.
Yeah, I've spent many a night going through legal documents.
Brittany is what we refer to as a true crime nerd.
But from there, it's just always hit me how flawed the system is, and even that's an understatement. It's just fundamentally unjust in these cases. And this was my first hard look at a wrongful conviction case, which has become a huge passion of mine to research and talk about. If you listen to the Juan Rivera case, which I'll bring up again.
Also, we have like cases in the works that are also going to be wrongful conviction cases. So
definitely stay tuned for that. They're definitely my kind of pet project within the podcast. They're just something that I find really important, really frustrating, and this case really paved the way for other cases to be shared and even solved in some cases. But at the end of the day, the person at the center of it is still locked up because of garbage people doing garbage work and just not caring. All of these people saw Adnan's life as unimportant, they saw Hae's life as unimportant, and they saw the lives of her family and Adnan's family as unimportant. And that's just the truth. They didn't care that a killer was still out there. They didn't care when they lied or when they skimmed documents instead of understanding, when they made horrible assumptions based on nothing, when they relied on bad evidence, bad witnesses. They just didn't care. And those two people and those two families will never be the same no matter how this works out. And it's just sad that that meant nothing to so many people. I have so much respect for Rabia. We had the awesome opportunity to meet her at CrimeCon last year, and we heard her and Susan and a couple other people talk about the case, and that was really great to be able to hear them talk and meet her.
That's actually where we bought the book Adnan's Story, was at CrimeCon.
But again, I have so much respect for Rabia powering through on this case and making it a priority, even though the rest of her life has been quite full. She has a family, a big career, and she's doing so much for so many people. And she still always spearheaded this case, and that's just so inspiring. She's definitely one of my heroes. It was also really cool to see how many people were independently dedicated to this, like Susan Simpson and a lot of other people that sent in information or helped Rabia develop their case. Pretty much all of Adnan's legal team. It's really cool to see people come together and really fight for justice in this.
Yeah, I really liked how in this book you were able to see who Adnan was as a person and really feel like you could get personal on that kind of level. Also, I liked when he talked about when he went to jail and he felt like he should stay fit for his family. So when they visited, they knew he was happy, and he always tried to stay positive and to let them know that he was safe and that he was okay. He also started researching law to find out what was happening to him. I can't imagine being 17 years old and getting thrown into this situation and not knowing any of the legal terms, not knowing what you can and can't do, not knowing if something is the end of the line or if there are steps you can take afterwards. So many loopholes. I can't imagine having to go through it. And so he's definitely a trooper for going through that. And I liked being able to hear his side of it and what he had to experience through and endure during all of it.
Yeah, that's one thing that really stood out to me is when Adnan said something like he would never again step in a courtroom and not know what was going on. So that statement really impacted me too. You see that he was really just a kid. He didn't know what was going on, and he did not want to feel that way anymore.
I also liked that Rabia personally knew Hae and Adnan because it put her in a place that other people who were on this case didn't really have access to. She was able to speak from personal experience and it contribute to the entirety of Adnan's case and how she wanted justice for Hae. I also thought it was really interesting in the part of the book where Adnan was giving keys to the librarian's car and he was told to go put books in her trunk for her. He went out of the jail unsupervised with keys to a car and a vehicle, and he absolutely could have run. He could have run and hid, changed his name, done his whole identity flip, missing person, people do it all the time, but he didn't. He went right back in because he's humble, he's honest, he's loyal, and you can tell all of that from his behaviors and his letters, and it just shows that he really believes that he's innocent, and he's hoping that the justice system will do the right thing and find the real perpetrator.
So that was a pretty heavy episode. It had a lot of information, and again, I hope you'll jump into this case, listen to Undisclosed if you haven't, and definitely read this book if you didn't get a chance to yet. And we know that this month's book was pretty dense, pretty heavy subject, so next month we're going to lighten it up a little bit for you, and we will be reading You Don't Own Me by Mary Higgins Clark and Alifair Burke. And that will be coming out on December 4th.
So go ahead on our website. You can click the little link, buy the book. You can get it audiobook. You can get it on Amazon, paperback, hardback, you name it, Kindle. Let's do it. get your books, get it ready. If you have Scribd, they actually have it on there with your subscription. So that's how we're going to be doing it. Join us and let's read a good story.
So the synopsis of You Don't Own Me is, quote, when we last saw Lori Moran, she had recently become engaged to her show's former host, Alex Buckley. Since then, the two have been happily planning a summer wedding and a honeymoon, preparing for Alex's confirmation to a federal judicial appointment, and searching for the perfect New York City home for their new life together. But then, Lori is approached by Robert and Cynthia Bell, parents of Dr. Martin Bell, a famously charming and talented physician who was shot dead as he pulled into the driveway of his Greenwich Village carriage house 5 years ago. The Bells are sure that Martin's disgraced and erratic wife, Kendra, carried out the murder. Determined to prove Kendra's guilt and win custody over their grandchildren, they pled with Lori to feature their son's case on Under Suspicion, ensuring her that Kendra is willing to cooperate. Kendra has lived under a blanket of suspicion since Martin's death, with tabloid media depicting her as a secretive, mentally unstable gold digger. Lori's show is a chance for her to clear her name, but unbeknownst to the Bells, Kendra has already refused once before to go forward with a reinvestigation of her husband's murder, and her statements to the contrary only add to the appearance of guilt. But once Lori dives into the case, she learns that Martin wasn't the picture-perfect husband, father, and doctor he appeared to be, and was carrying secrets of his own. And what does the web of lies ensnaring the Bell family have to do with a dangerous stranger who gazes at Lori from afar and thinks she is actually quite a lovely girl? I'm sure she's going to be missed. Dun dun dun.
I've already started this book for the month, and it's pretty good so far, not gonna lie. So you don't want to miss out.
And it's a nice short read, so should be good.
Yeah, I think it's only on Scribd. It's like 317 pages, so you can do it on a weekend, you know.
I think the audiobook's about 7 hours, so I gave you a nice, short and sweet story this time. So thank you so much for listening. This case means a lot to both of us, and we've been talking about doing this episode for pretty much a year now, thinking about the book. Jump into the Facebook groups, the message boards, and let's try to bring some justice for not just Adnan, but Hae as well.
Thanks for jumping into the abyss with us.